Howdy everyone, it's Thursday. We have another 2 hours of reviews. We'll start with something C# related and then we either go to JSON or networking depending on how we feel about them. Alrighty, so who wants to take a first stab at this one?
I can give it a go. Let's see. So for collection literals, for collection types that the compiler does not know how to construct directly, we would want to be able to allow the type to be annotated with a kind of a factory method that the compiler can use to construct an instance of the collection type. And so the factory method would be, the proposal is the factory method would be indicated by the collection builder attribute on the collection type. The collection builder attribute would point to a factory type and a method by method name. And then the compiler would look up that that factory method for that target collection type.
Right. So, like for a mutable list, of T, it'll call the non-generic immutable list create, and then it'll call add on that. But how does it know how to finish?
It will not call create. Or sorry, it will call create, but it will not call add. It calls the create that takes a read-only span. And then that read-only span gets populated into the immutable list, however it wants to do it, and returns a complete initialized element. There is no, from the compiler's perspective, there is no add, there is no finish. It's just
one shot.
Here's the thing. Here's a list.
So things using the attribute need to take read-only span of T.
Correct. The next line after the proposal does clarify that we basically only recognize pattern collection type, method name, read-only span. That's it. No optional parameters. No best type lookups. Exactly that.
So you recognize these as well? Is that what you're saying?
There is enough room in the spec to let the compiler optimize better if it can. And for those two things, because everyone uses list and immutable array,
right.
Those two things will do some special stuff, but that's not the general pattern type, and it's not the API we're proposing today.
Gotcha. So basically, these APIs already exist, right? The create methods, I presumably already added the read-only span.
I wasn't in the meeting that discussed them, but I believe we've already talked about them. Yes.
The immutable collection, creative read-only span. I think we approved those when this came up previously.
Yeah.
Well, they exist since 5.0, so I guess they're in there for a while. Or maybe we just...
No, we must have added it to something else. So our set and queue being ignored for this, or are they being just deferred to if they get around to supporting the collection pattern, they'll just work?
Can you scroll up?
Hold on. Too many windows?
Set and queue are in... Oh, you mean regular set and queue, not...
Yeah. When this came up the first time, I remember Steve had some stuff for system collection generic queue of T and system collection generic hash set of T. Wait, hash set might already work. So, but I think queue was special.
And both of those should work because they work with collection initializers today. If at some point in the future you wanted to add this attribute to them with some better builder pattern, it would just pick it up. But
okay.
Yeah. And these types don't work with collection initializers today. I mean, they do, but they fail.
Right. Yeah, they don't work the way you want.
And then just to confirm, when you say the pattern is collection type, method, read-only span, the return collection type has to match the type that the attribute is on, modulo generics, right?
No. It has to match the return. It has to match the collection type being constructed. So collections Marshall, for example, could have some method on. We could have easily put the create method on collections Marshall, and then
Right, but it'll have to return like exactly the type that's being that the attribute is applied to. Like if immutable array was a class, it couldn't return a like specialized immutable array as the
I see
return
what you're
type
saying.
of the declared method.
I see what you're saying. Yes.
Okay.
And you don't do anything for dictionaries, right?
Dictionaries aren't part of collection literals yet. That'll be C# 13, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, this seems like a reasonable scoping and shape to me.
Do you have any, like, you allow interfaces? I mean, I understand why conceptually you would, but we don't have a use case for this right now, right?
Oh, we do. I mean, we're going to enable IEnumerable. You can say IEnumerable of E equals a collection literal. I don't know as though IEnumerable might be special cased by the compiler because it's so central,
Right.
but we want other people to be able to emulate the same thing if they want. Like, for example, we could do this with IEmutable array, or I say IEmutable list instead of just immutable list.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was asking.
Observable could do something with IObservable.
I mean, the thing with collections is that because of the design of the attribute, the only person that can do it is the owner of the interface, right? So if we...
That's correct.
Because you're allowing interfaces, I mean, it raises the question, now should we attribute IEmutable set or IEmutable list, right? Because you're the only ones who can do it.
Yes. I'm actually rather surprised. I did try to get Cyrus to join this meeting, but he seems to be offline. I'm rather surprised that they're not in this list because he's definitely showed them in LDM as attributed. So.
I mean, to go down the interface rabbit hole, do we want to have opinions as to the default implementation of the interface? Because that's what putting the attribute on it would do.
So one thing that we've said in terms of, for example, IEnumerable, is we only guarantee that the type returned is an IEnumerable. We don't guarantee anything about, oh, if you did IEnumerable of int equals an empty collection literal. Well, we might give you array.empty. We might give you something else that is cached, versus if you say IEnumerable of int and you put 3 things in it, maybe we'll give you a list. Maybe we'll give you something that's read only. Like the compiler has complete choice in what it does for these things. And so I similarly think if we were to attribute immutable dictionary or whatever, or IEmutable dictionary or whatever, the method would return an IEmutable dictionary. And if you try and take a dependency on it actually being implemented, like the thing actually being returned is an immutable dictionary, not an IEmutable dictionary, then that's on you.
I mean, I love that that's, the way that the language team thinks about things, but from the BCL perspective, if someone is ever capable of hard casting an answer and it works 100% of the time in any version, then it is now true for the rest of time. So we would need to either say whatever type it's returning, we're just 100% clear on it, and it calls, I set of T says, okay, I'm actually hash set, or it returns a thing that it cannot be cast beyond the interface, which can then hide the actual implementation. But the implementation is the definition, and people hard cast things, and then we're too afraid to break them.
And that's I think what Fred is saying is, like, spec-wise, we don't guarantee that we don't break people, but I think the practical reality is if we ever change our mind, and instead of giving you an iHash set and an immutable hash set, we give you an immutable sorted set, that probably will break someone somewhere, right? So, I mean, it doesn't mean we can't do it. It just means if we do change our mind, it's probably not free. So
right. Well, that's why I think that from the BCL maintenance perspective, we would not want to ever decorate interfaces, or at least we would want to be really sure before we decorate them.
Yeah, I think
the classes is or structs in the case of a mutable array is you get what it says, and there's no ambiguity, so it's great.
Well, I think that kind of
Interfaces is
depends on
weird.
how you want to use the feature, right? So I think the practical problem is, right, if you call a method that takes an interface, I think it is desirable from the customer side on the call side to just be able to pass in a collection literal, right? And as soon as we don't support interfaces, you're basically saying it can never work, right? So I think that
And
that would probably not be desirable.
And I want to be clear, it will work for anything that list implements.
So a list or iList?
List.
Right. So any collection type or any interface
Like if
that
you have
list implements, you'll choose to use list.
We won't necessarily choose to use list. No, that's what I was saying earlier. Like IEnumerable, list implements IEnumerable, which is why IEnumerable works. But we are not necessarily choosing to use list. We are simply saying that list is the canonical collection type, the sequential collection type in .NET, and the interfaces that it implements are the canonical interface set of collection types. So I read only list.
I think what you're saying is like if you, when you have a raw collection literal, like the natural type would be list of T unless the compiler chooses otherwise. So that means anything that you can convert a list of T to will just work. Is that what you're saying?
Mostly, but I wouldn't use the word natural type.
Fair enough, but
that
like
has specific meanings.
but basically that means that anything that list extends, by definition, you can always pass a collection literal to, right?
That is correct.
And so that means, okay, that would basically exclude the immutable interfaces.
It would.
So that would mean
you don't have to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just saying that we're already kind of crossing the interface bridge.
Yeah,
is more what I'm saying.
And I think I buy that because people do like to use interfaces a lot. So that means if you want to make the literal feature useful, I think you kind of have to.
Right, but this, just talking through the breaking change risk, like, so if somebody's calling a method that takes iCollection and they pass open curly 1 2 3 close curly, and the compiler in 2023 says, oh, that's easy, it'll be list of T, and somebody's now as casting it on the receiver side, like from the BCL perspective, we would say that now has to work forever. Is the language really willing to say that if you compile with next year's compiler, you might get a thing that won't successfully as back to list?
That's correct.
You guys are braver than we are.
I mean, I would say, like, I mean, I don't think it's that bad because, I mean, you're basically making it sound like we will definitely change our mind on that, right? I mean, I think if somebody says I want an I hash set, an I immutable set, if we say screw it, we'll just give you a hash set, are we really gonna, like, how likely is it that we're gonna change our mind on this one, right? So it's not like we will definitely have to change it at some point. Yeah, for some of these interfaces, we only have one implementation anyways, right? So Q only has one. Stack only has one.
It's one of those, just making sure that when we're putting it on an interface, that we're being certain about what we want. So then this goes back to could an interface, if it uses the collection builder attribute here, are you going to match the pattern if the thing that it calls returns a concrete type that derives the interface instead of the interface itself? So this goes back to the pattern matching rule of the attribute.
Sorry, Cyrus was saying something in the chat, and I was reading that, and I missed part of what you said.
On I set of T, we say that it calls hash set of T dot create, which returns hash set of T. Does that match the rule?
I'm not 100% certain on that. I'm hoping Cyrus, since he's clearly, or maybe Chuck knows.
Yeah, I mean, we put a stake in the ground the other day and said, no, the return type has to match the type that the attribute is applied to.
Okay, even for interfaces.
Yeah, we set it across the board.
Okay. I mean, I like that answer. It's a very good answer to understand. I'm just, again, thinking through so any of the sets if we want to put here's how we want you, or sorry, any of the collection types that are not just linear data. If we do this, we have to have a method that slightly opacifies the type, and then we have the choice of hiding the type or supporting the forever cast. Okay. Yeah, I still think the shape looks reasonable. There's the question of, do we want to start slapping it on interface types right now? And I'm okay with saying no.
Yeah. Levi, I wanted to bring up something that you mentioned in the chat. So the generic method, like the generics here would work fine. Like if the create method was inside immutable array, that would work, because we're looking for a specific immutable array type. So it's not immutable array T. We'd be looking inside immutable array of int for a create method, which takes a read-only span of int, and that would work just fine. It's just for convenience in .NET, we put them on non-generic methods, so type inference could work.
Right, and then
manually typing out.
But the type of you would have to put there would be immutable array, open angle, close angle, right?
Right.
I think you would actually,
because you can't say the
have
T there because you're outside the T scope.
Yes.
So it would just be the match that the generic arity.
But you wouldn't need this, right? You're saying basically if the type already has a constructor, you would just find it, right? Probably, right? That's why you don't need it on list of T, right?
Right.
Well, list of T matches the collection pattern rule.
Well, yeah, I mean, but that's what I mean by this. You're basically saying if you have a collection literal, you know the target type, and then you can just say, do you have a constructor that takes a read-only span? Great, use it, right?
Yeah, the other thing with this, of course, is that collection literals still support the old collection initializer pattern, right? Like the whole create a new thing, call add repeatedly, and then give you the resulting thing. That will still work, but we want to be more efficient where we can, and so that's what this pattern is for.
That's why you only need it for immutables, because that's the only cases where we have a factory method on a different type, basically. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
right.
The scenario was if I were creating my own immutable type and I wanted to bury the factory in a nested class under my immutable type of T, would this feature work? And the answer sounds like yes. I would say collection builder type of my immutable type open close dot nested.
Yep, that should work.
One question I have is you allow multiple. What does it mean?
I don't know.
Multiple is true?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this the allow multiple was there when we were talking about supporting multiple different patterns. I think the for .NET 8, what we're suggesting is that there would be just a single pattern, which is a static method. And to something that was said a moment ago, I think we were saying this, it's a static method on a non-generic type, so it wouldn't work. I mean, we can change this obviously, but the proposal was that it wouldn't work as a nested type on your generic collection.
Oh, I had misunderstood the proposal then. I thought it would.
I mean, we could extend this so that it works for non-generic methods in a generic type, for instance, but that wasn't what the proposal was. So it'd be a generic method, potentially generic method on a static, sorry, on a non-generic type. Takes a single parameter. It's a read-only span of T, where T is the element type of your collection, and it returns the type that it was, the collection type that the attribute was applied to. So that's the pattern we were imagining for .NET 8. We had previously talked about supporting other patterns, such as a construct method that returns has an out parameter that you could write directly to. And so there is a question of how might we extend this in the future if we want to use the same attribute for multiple patterns. And back to the original question, I think that's where the allow multiple true came from here.
Naively, I was thinking it's just overloads of create, or whatever the method you're pointing to.
Yeah, well, if you look back up at the top, there was the like design one, and that had some outs in it, and I think that's where the like, depending on some subtlety, it'll using the outs as generic variants, but I don't remember. Sorry, return variants. But I don't know how that would apply if you care that the type exactly match.
I mean, given that you don't really point to a method, but effectively just a method group, I was thinking you have versioning effectively built in. Yeah, because once you have more than one, you have to decide anyway which one you pick, right? So it's effectively the same as resolving the overload. I mean, unless you're saying like, oh, what if you want the method to live on a different type? But I don't know why you would want to do this. I mean, I'm fine with saying allow multiple is true. It just seems unnecessary.
Yeah, because if a scenario came up in the future where it made sense to make allow multiples being true, the only thing that would be broken is if you were using like the C# 14 plus compiler and had the .NET 8 runtime or .NET 8 target set, and it would say, no, you're not allowed to have multiple. And you'd be like, but it says so right here. It's like, well, then pick a newer minimum version. Or we can just leave it multiple.
I think I'd be fine with limiting it, but
yeah, I think the argument I was sort of trying to make is saying false here and flipping it to true later doesn't hurt too many people.
Yeah, it's certainly the more conservative choice. You can always widen it later. Restricting it later is not that great.
Because even if we mark it allow multiple true right now, I assume that the current version of the compiler would be like, this makes no sense. I'm just going to reject it. So we should just build that into the attribute loading rules.
I don't believe we actually care about whether or not an attribute is declared allow multiple.
Well, the question is what happens if you find more than one application? How do you choose today?
Right, the C# 12 compiler will probably report an error if there are multiple collection builder attributes on the type, because we won't be able to choose.
Then perhaps the answer is don't allow multiple.
Right, that's kind of what I'm hearing.
And it looks like Cyrus showed up just to watch the approved label getting applied.
I came to rubber stamp this, so yeah.
Happiness?
Yeah.
Cool. Then thanks everyone. And then on to the next thing. So when the meeting started, the networking folks were asking whether we can do networking first. In the agenda, I put JSON stuff. So the JSON crew, are you cool with that or not cool with that?
As long as we get time for it today, then I'm fine by it.
How much time do you think you need for this?
I don't know, half an hour?
And I suggest let's do this now so we don't run out of time.
Right. I would recommend going to the next one first, since both are JSON, since there makes more sense to go to the first one. All right, then. So this essentially is a proposal to extend the JSON source generation options attribute, which is essentially a way to specify JSON serializer options at compile time. So this is effectively just extending it so that it has complete parity with the runtime equivalent of JSON serializer options, so that users don't need to go through the boilerplate of manually configuring their JSON serializer context. Instead, they can set everything at compile time and just tailor their default instance to how they please. A couple of exceptions, obviously. They would need a bit further innovation. I'm just trying to cover the most requested and most easy to implement knobs that were missing. So the proposed properties and the new constructor added to the attribute completely mirror the ones that exist in JSON serializer options. The only difference in type and shape is the converters property, which in the runtime JSON serializer options is an IList of JSON converter. Obviously, that can't go in a property. So in this case, it's an array of types where users are effectively expected to specify an array of JSON converter types. I have, I think, an example in how that looks in the API usage section for if you're interested. But effectively, if you look at the third line of that declaration, yeah, you basically define an array and specify a bunch of converters that you would like to use for your default setting. I've also included what the source-generated code would look like. Effectively, it would map to an equivalent initializer for the JSON serializer options, filling in the relevant properties.
Yeah, makes sense. So does this mean every time now we add another option, we basically have to do it in two places?
Yes. For options that actually make sense to map to the compile time layer, of course.
Well, it kind
only
of
ones that
to,
can be
right?
expressed as an attribute literal.
That. And that has been solved in the case of JSON naming policy, and this is not new. This has existed since .NET 6. So System.json shipped an enum known as JSON node naming policy, which is an enum that acts as a proxy for the JSON naming policy, which is an abstract class, so that people can specify that on attribute declarations. I presume that if we want to add new knobs that actually take classes as arguments, we would need to approve similar proxy enums so that they can be declared at compile time.
Well, or we do what we do with the converters, right? You just have a rule that says you have to be able to new them up.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously it depends on the context. Like, for example, I left out reference handling because this is a closed class where you specify singletons, and that would need an enum, so I kind of left that out from scope from this proposal.
So does it mean if you use reference handling today, you want to move to a source generator, you just can't?
Oh, you absolutely can, but you basically need to do the boilerplate, which I've detailed at the beginning in the motivation section. You would basically have to...
Sorry, my mouse is not doing what I wanted to do.
Right. So you would basically need to create an options instance, configure it, pass it, and create a new context. So basically create a universe from scratch and use that to serialize. It would still use the source generator, but it would necessitate a bit of boilerplate.
It's not actually too bad, but if the idea is just reducing the number of people who have to deal with it, then see the virtue.
So this is what they have to do today, right? They basically have to construct their own context just to be able to set these guys here, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But these are still the source generation options. How do I set the options that are not source generation related? That are only existing on the JSON serializer options?
Some of these options are indeed not directly related to source gen. Some have impact in what code does get generated, but others are kind of independent. These have been added, like, for example, max depth. That is a value that doesn't have any impact on how code is being generated.
That's what I mean. So we lift those now and expose them here, right? But
yeah,
what happens for cases where we didn't lift them, like the reference handling? How do I set them then?
You would need to create a JSON sorry, I made a typo in the example. That should have been a new JSON serializer options.
This guy
where,
here?
Yeah, that guy should be in JSON serializer options.
Gotcha.
And you would specify a reference handler there, and then you would pass that to the underlying context. Yeah, apologies for that.
Gotcha. That makes sense now. Okay, then I get what you're trying to say. So in that sense, even if we don't expose the property, like it's, there's a workaround. It just is a little bit less discoverable. And then presumably so I guess what they can normally do is like the serializer context has an options thing somewhere, or how does this?
Yeah, it has an options instance, and it has a default context that you can access as a singleton. And I think the other benefit of doing it on the attribute is that you kind of eliminate the concern of lifetime management of your JSON serializer options, because of course you would need to take care to not allocate a new options instance every time you want to serialize because of the known performance issues that this has. So just being able to tailor your default instance to whatever configuration you desire kind of removes that concern, because the source generator will do it for you. So much less code to type, basically.
Yeah.
Sorry if I missed this, but and I know that we're just adding properties before or to the existing JSON source generation options attribute. But if you mix them, the current option wins, I suppose, right? Is that the correct understanding? Like the runtime option?
Correct. Every generated context comes with a public constructor that accepts a JSON serializer options. And if you create a new instance and you give it something, that obviously wins.
Cool. Well, is there any ask for like web defaults or anything like that, or is that already there?
That's actually on new constructor. So yes,
it's the very top line in the example.
Sorry, I see it. Awesome, cool.
Yeah. Did you expose that on the attribute with a get only property? Like, I know you're taking it as a constructor parameter because the underlying thing takes it as a constructor parameter, which means you don't really want to have to deal with the somebody called set later. But since it is on an attribute, if it takes it as a constructor parameter, it should have a get only property associated with it just from attribute design.
So the issue with that is that if you look at how JSON serializer defaults is implemented in the runtime JSON serializer options, it actually just maps to other properties. So it basically says...
So yeah. I know what the source generator is doing with it. It's just passing it through to the constructor. But if somebody calls get all custom attributes, can they see what JSON serializer defaults was passed in? And so you need a get only property on the attribute type to say what they specified in the constructor.
So I would probably push back on that, and that's mostly because, like I said, that enum is actually mapping to other values in the attribute, and the same is the case with the runtime options instance. So that default is essentially a set of default configuration, as it were, that populates different properties, different other properties in both the options class and the attribute. So I would say that.
So
it essentially normalizes to mapping that value to predetermined values to the other properties.
Okay, so if somebody builds this attribute and just says JSON serializer defaults.web, and then calls get custom attributes and inspects all of the properties on this attribute, will it correctly reflect the state that it would have that is equivalent to web?
Correct. It will have set all the relevant properties matching the JSON serializer options. You wouldn't be able to tell whether this was set explicitly by an individual property or whether it was created by the constructor, unless you're consuming it from Roslyn. But you would be able to tell that two pieces of configuration are equivalent.
I mean, you can at runtime look that up as well. You can see what was passed into the constructor.
Right.
Okay.
You use custom attribute data instead of custom attribute, but yeah, it's there.
Yes.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I agree. The information is redundant, so it's not really worth exposing, because like Eric said, the enum is just a shortcut saying please pre-populate all of these properties.
Yeah.
And like, okay, great.
Well, so the one difference, and maybe it's a non-use case, and so it doesn't matter. But if somebody called, get custom attributes while they were reading from one library and using it to write a definition into new source code to go into a new library, losing the defaults would mean that when they write down all of these property values, any future property values that would be keyed off of the default set, they will no longer, their code is no longer equivalent in the two. It's only point in time equivalent.
I think that's okay, because if what you're doing is, if you care about what the user wrote instead of what the runtime behavior is, you shouldn't be looking at the attribute type itself. You should be looking at custom attribute data, because custom attribute data explicitly describes what was written in the CS file. And
Okay.
It sounds like that's what the user cares about in that scenario.
Okay. I guess I've just never played with that aspect of attribute reflection.
And
I love
normally
that.
that's what you do, right? You're basically saying, you look at the constructor, you see what defaults you start with, and then that's what you emit first, right?
Yeah.
You basically translate this, right? So if any of these fields changes here, because we changed the defaults, it doesn't really matter. Because if you only specify the ones here that were actually specified in the initialization of the attribute, right? So if somebody doesn't set max depth, you never had to know what the default for web was because you set it here, basically, right?
Yeah.
And I think that a person would do the same thing. So in that sense, even if we change the defaults, it should not impact the any sort of code that processes it correctly. It just means that the code that parses the attribute always has to kind of understand the constructor convention and say, okay, I apply these defaults first, and then ideally it does that by not actually understanding any defaults. It just basically starts with the default with the defaults and then overrides only the ones that were specified, which seems like a reasonable design point.
Right. Well, I mean, the generator gets to look at what words were actually written. I was looking at the
right.
If you used runtime reflection to translate from an existing library into new source, and apparently the answer is you don't want the hydrated attribute, you want the attribute data, and that's fine.
I mean, we could make that work if we cared enough, right? But
yeah, so I think I'm convinced that you don't need to get to reflect the constructor property or the constructor value, even though that's the way attributes are supposed to work. It seems.
I mean, exposing this
justified
exposing this thing here as a property would not be bad. I mean, I don't think we care enough, but I don't think we'll be wrong.
I don't think it would be the end of the world, because it doesn't matter in the end. So
yeah.
Sure, if people think that it should be added, then fine. I probably won't have any use for it in the code base, but we can add it for completeness.
Yeah, I mean, I bring it up just because it's the attribute
rule. Yeah.
Guideline is everything that's a constructor parameter is a get only property, and everything else that's a property is a get set property.
Would it need to be nullable to reflect the case where you call the default constructor?
Presumably the default is JSON serial or default's general.
The default should be general, but given that we want to reflect how it was declared, should it maybe be nullable to reflect the fact that the particular constructor wasn't called at all?
Well, I mean, you would just say the other constructor conceptually calls the other constructor that takes the defaults and passes in general, right?
Yes, but I guess going back to the point that assuming that we wanted to introspect and decide which constructor was called, maybe nullable would be better.
That's not what the rule is saying, though, right? Because basically what you're doing here is you're just saying, pretend this is just a regular type that is instantiated by the user. Just allow them to query the data that was passed into the constructor, right? And that's normally the way we do it. We don't just say, oh, we expose exactly which constructor was called. We just say, happened was you called the default overload, and that's equivalent of calling JSON serializer defaults.general. So the property only gives you back general. You don't know whether it was by the default or whether somebody actually explicitly passed it in.
Right.
Yeah, I think both are fine by me. Like I said, I won't have any use for it.
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be nullable. Our general rule for attributes is they're not allowed to overload constructors anyway. But so saying you got it from implicit general or explicit general isn't relevant. So get only properties.
I would push back pretty strongly against this. I think it's going to mislead people.
So
and
you don't have the property at all.
Yeah, I would leave the property out entirely, because if the very concrete scenario is I want to know what the user wrote as opposed to what the runtime behavior is, there's already a way for them to access that.
Yeah, that's fine.
And if we're saying like the fact that all these other properties are kind of populated at runtime and don't necessarily reflect what the user wrote anyway. Like if the very concrete scenario is I want to know what they wrote, like we shouldn't mislead people into believing this is the right way to get that information.
Yep, I can get behind that.
We could add it later. So one thing,
yeah, exactly.
Saying we would
add it later. Add it later if we need to.
Yeah. So one thing I was getting at with the runtime options is I was just thinking about the typical usage of, JSON serializer context with like ASP.NET minimal APIs, right? Where you register it with an existing options like type info resolver chain. And like today, if you don't specify any of these custom options or specify web defaults, like I'm pretty sure you get web defaults, right? Because the containing options object specifies web defaults. So I'm wondering how that interacts with this. Like, will ASP.NET developers like set these options, and will they end up being like overridden by the global options?
No. The answer is no. So like this particular feature only concerns the interaction insofar as you're using the context.default instance. But as soon as you go into type info resolver chain territory, like these things aren't important because you're specifying different runtime configuration anyway. You might be able to read the options instance and copy some of that configuration over, but again, you'd need to use like the copy constructor or things like that. Like some sort of work at runtime needs to happen, if that makes sense.
Okay. So I guess like the problem that I potentially see, and maybe this can be fixed with documentation, is like we're going to be telling people in ASP.NET, like, hey, like if you want to work in AOT, like, define these JSON serializer contexts for your types, or a single one if you can, and then just add it to like the type info resolver chain, just like insert it at the beginning before like any reflection stuff. And like I could see someone thinking, because they could apply options to other contexts, that like it would work, but it wouldn't, right? Like it just wouldn't, because we'd be using the global ASP.NET options.
Yeah, that is currently the case with the existing options on that attribute, of course. Like,
right.
Of course, with the exception of the knobs that actually influence what code is being generated. So, some of these things, they actually are tied to the code being generated, and there's a lot of complicated invalidation logic in place in case somebody sets a value at runtime that is incompatible with what was written at compile time. So, like, all these concerns come into play at all times.
Okay, yeah, I agree though. This isn't new. I just haven't really used the attribute before.
I think it was it you, Jeremy, that mentioned that we shouldn't have constructor overloads on attributes in general? Do you think that might be a reason why we might want to consider an attribute?
I mean, so the general answer for attributes is required properties are constructor parameters and optional properties are get set. properties. Something can't be both required and not, which means you generally can't have overloading. And so it's not that they're necessarily verboten, it's just that they fall out of this doesn't make sense. In this case, it doesn't quite-ish make sense, but it has some semantics, and generator attributes are maybe different than normal attributes, and shrug.
Yeah. I guess I should say that one of the reasons that led me into proposing a constructor overload as opposed to like having yet another property is that actually the JSON serializer default property has precedence over some other properties in that list. So whereas when you just set things in a property bag, a user wouldn't necessarily expect that, A overrides B, and therefore A gets applied first, and then B will override that. So kind of putting it on the constructor makes this a bit more explicit, if you will.
Right. So if this was if the JSON serializer defaults was a get set property, then the answer should be that the attribute should not tell you anything. So like max depth would then become nullable, default buffer size would become nullable, and this would only write down what someone wrote instead of being able to be asked, what does this mean? And that would be a fine alternate direction, but I think what you've done here is fine.
All right. Then let's move to the previous one, right?
Yeah. Right. So this was actually brought up about a month ago when we were reviewing the JSON string enum converter of T thingy. So just as a recap, we added a new enum converter type because what was shipped in earlier versions of system.txt.json, the untyped JSON string enum converter doesn't actually work in AOT. But we shipped a generic variant that lets people like explicitly specify the enum type that they want supported in angle brackets. But one kind of problem that was identified with that is that now people need to actually, explicitly identify all their enums in their type graph and explicitly specify the converters applied to these specific enums. So I think somebody proposed that, what if there was some kind of flag in the JSON source generation options attribute that basically says, hey, whenever you detect an enum in the type graph, just default to the string enum converter. So the idea is there that you let the source generator do the heavy lifting and apply the right converters to the right types. And it would be equivalent to a user having to decorate everything within the type graph.
Not everybody at once. Are we good? Or?
Well, because the question that came up with the attribute was every time we add a source generator option, we now have to add it on the attribute. But this one's adding it on the attribute and not on the serializer options. Wouldn't this make sense to just also put on the serializer options? Like, why is this related to generation?
If you put it on the serializer options, like an umbrella rule that says, oh, just use string enum converter, that by definition requires dynamic code. Because now you would actually instruct the serializer to, whatever enum you identify in the type graph, just create this generic JSON converter of that enum and instantiate it for me. So that actually wouldn't make sense as a piece of runtime configuration. It actually exists, and it exists in the form of the existing untyped JSON string enum converter that you just add to your list of converters. However, that requires dynamic code. So it can't work in AOT. This, on the other hand, we can rely on the source generator to do all the specializations that compile time.
I'm not sure I fully understand what you said, but basically you were saying the way you do it in the runtime configuration is by just passing in a converter.
Yes, and specifically for this case, we want a piece of configuration that applies string enum conversion as an umbrella rule. But we're not actually able to get that to work in the case of AOT without you're not able to do that in a runtime that doesn't support dynamic code because you would need to be instantiating generic converters for these enums at runtime.
Yeah, basically I think what you're saying is this, in the case of source generation, you don't actually use a converter at all. You basically just inspect the enums at design time. It's basically hard-coded inside of the source generator to begin with, and then you just emit those as literals directly from whatever serializer code you generate. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Effectively, it would generate code where for every node in the type graph where you find an enum, it would say, oh, I'm just going to emit some code that says new JSON string enum converter angle brackets T, and where T is your enum in that particular case. And that would solve the dynamic code problem.
Yeah, I don't think he's writing this like switch case 1, write down the word public, case 2. I think he's still leaving that up to the enum 2 string so that you don't get the values bound at compile time, you get them at runtime.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
From Emo's question, I heard him asking, was the source generator writing the number to string and string to number mapping table inside the generated code? But I think you're still deferring to like enum.getValue and enum.toString, right?
So the problem isn't the reading and the writing of the enum string values per se. It's the creation of a JSON converter of open angle brackets your enum type. Necessarily to be able to serialize anything in a type graph, you would need to be able to instantiate generic types like that. And if you don't know ahead of time what the enum types that you will be encountering, then you won't be able to do this unless your runtime supports dynamic code. To be able to basically say string enum converter of angle brackets dot make generic type.
I think
so. If somebody turns this on and they have a type that's supposed to be serialized by numeric value instead of by string, how do they undo that? Or sorry, how do they do that?
So based on the implementation I'm looking at, you wouldn't. So that would essentially instruct the source generator to effectively hard code string enum serialization for every type that it uses.
Right, but is there a JSON numeric enum converter type that you could bind on the converters? Is there a converter that you can do to say don't use the string converter for the enum? I mean, you could obviously create your own, but
no, there is none actually, and that's a good point. So there's no mechanism where you could opt out from a specific property being picked up by that blanket policy.
So do we just need to approve the shape of JSON enum or JSON value enum converter? No, that JSON integral enum numeric enum converter.
Yeah, I guess we could do that. JSON numeric converter of T. Yeah.
Well, if it's JSON string enum converter, then it'd probably be JSON numeric enum converter.
Yeah. Or following naming convention from the JSON token type enum, it could be JSON number enum converter of T.
Sure.
And effectively, that would be copying the API shape of JSON string enum converter of T.
Yep. Okay, so adding this property and that type so that somebody can undo this property in a scoped manner.
I'm just gonna paste the API in chat. And actually, the constructor overload that accepts naming policy, that can be scrapped because it's not applicable. So it would just have a single default constructor.
Yeah, so you want to, presumably that's on a different namespace.
Yes, that would be under the.
Or is it under system text JSON serialization?
Yep, that's the one.
Okay, so the same namespace as the attribute.
Same namespace.
Okay. So there's a type in the Teams chat window. If you want to just copy it and merge it in the answer email.
Sorry, what is the question?
Well, there's less a question and just more copy it into your buffer, because we need to add the JSON converter type to undo the global option.
Yep.
I mean, we don't need to, but it seems like a nice thing to do.
So this one would go into JSON serialization as well? Or would that be into the converter one?
Same namespace.
Okay.
Does that work with, so first off, does this feature work with net standard, or is this only like a net 6+ feature?
So that should work in net standard as well.
Does the attribute that's being proposed, because it has a generic constraint on system.enum, work in net standard?
I believe it does. Like,
if you language and sign up, yes.
a runtime issue.
I mean, it's just
so just use a newer version of the compiler and you're good to go.
Well, JSON string enum converter, I think, says it's only defined in the core family, that it's not in the standard.
Oh, is it?
Oh no, I see net standard 2.0 and above. Okay, so that must work then. Okay.
All right. APIs of .NET says net standard 2.0 and above, but MSDN just says net core 3 and higher.
That might just be because
Although,
of the way it's coded.
To be perfectly fair, I've never seen any use case where people want to serialize enums as numbers, despite this being the default behavior that we shipped. But I mean, sure, it's good to have an opt-out.
Well, I mean, the thing, so I put in chat, it's interesting that binding flags is the example that's given here, because binding flags is an example of an enum where we add values to it from release to release. And if the default behavior is to serialize by string instead of by value, then every time you try serializing a binding flags enum, you risk breaking.
Right, because you'll get a name from the future and won't know how to map it back.
Yeah. Like it's one of those things that serializing by value, or serializing by name, you actually have to be really careful that you know for a fact that the enum values are fixed for all time. And within the framework, we actually almost never make that guarantee.
And by which you mean the set will not be added to.
Correct.
Because the mapping of a name to a number is not allowed to change.
Right, that is fixed, but like we add enum, we add new names all the time.
Right.
Like, of course we do. It's just a new API.
Yes, people serializing enums by name across framework or even just their own library versions. I've seen that break them before, and then the answer is, oh, go switch all the stuff from the easy to read to the thing that works, which is serialized by number.
Yeah.
And
so just, I understand the desire to make it look pretty, but just be aware of the fact that the user should be in full control over all types that are being serialized if this becomes the preferred default.
yeah, and that's why I wanted the escape hatch concurrent with the feature. So. I don't know that your bullet makes sense there, Emo.
Which one? Oh,
We
yeah,
considered
sorry.
exposing the constructor parameters of
Yeah,
property.
sorry, that was one of the previous one.
Yeah.
But we are good with the shape otherwise, right? That's basically what we discussed.
Yeah. So we did add the JSON number enum converter to balance the feature out.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks.
All right, then let's go back to the networking portion here. So which one was it?
Let's finish the HTTP factory. I think that's for our system, so I feel that's higher priority, and that's what we gonna break off on Tuesday.
That is this one here, probably, right?
Yep.
Right. All right, who wants to
Okay.
talk?
Yeah, I will talk about it. Just to remind everyone, HTTP Client Factory is an extension to configure HTTP clients in DI and by name, and then resolve them in their code. And the NuGet package is built for .NET Standard framework and .NET Core, like .NET 5+. There's been an investigation by extensions team to learn which are the most used patterns by users who use HTTP Client Factory, and it has shown that a lot of people who use the factory on .NET 5+, they use Socket HTTP Handler. And also there's been an ask to be able to configure Socket HTTP Handler via iConfiguration, meaning you would set all the kind of simple parameters like connect time output, connection lifetime, and so on in your configuration file, and then just use it in the configurations without having to write it in the code. And if you would want to change that, you would just change the configuration file and then restart the service, and it would apply the changes. So that's where I propose the new extension method that would be only for .NET 5 plus because it is about socket HTTP handler, which didn't exist previously, and the first method here is a kind of shortcut to set socket HTTP handler as a primary handler and configure it in an action. And the action is nullable, so if you just want to set socket HTTP handler, you can use this as parameterless way. And the second one is with the builder, and the builder is kind of essential here because it allows you to configure the socket HTTP handler from iConfiguration section. This is the last method that is on the screen right now, and also chain it to additional configuration in the action. So you could set some things that you cannot set in configuration, for example, some callbacks like connect callback or whatever. And it also will allow someone to additionally add some new configuration methods to chain to have like a more fluent API, because like initially the ask was to kind of be able to set specific properties. So in the example down below, if you could please scroll to the last example. Emma, could you please scroll? Yes, so the examples here are like with the parameterless way of just setting socket HTTP handler as a primary handler, configuration via action, and configuration via builder with chaining the setting parameters from configuration section and setting things via action in addition to that. And below is the example of how the configuration might look like. And could you please scroll a little bit further? Yeah, so this is kind of illustrative to what can be further achieved, for example, in third-party library with these builders. So some additional extension methods could be added. For example, even in .NET extensions, methods like disable remote certificate validation could be added there. That's why kind of as opposed to what we discussed last time about the builder, I feel like we do need the builder here in this case. So.
All right. Oh, sorry. Was that a pause? So just one like small thing. Well, it's important, but it's easy. Is iConfiguration section should be iConfiguration, unless you're actually using any of the additional properties on section, which I doubt you are. There are very few public APIs that take an iConfiguration section.
Okay.
But fortunately, iConfiguration section implements iConfiguration, so like it should only support more things. The other thing, so we're presumably, so these two callbacks run at different times, right? One is like pre service collection building, and one is after the service provider is created. So like the configure handler and configure builder, yeah.
Yes. Configure handler one is called upon creation of the handler. and configure builder is, yeah, it's happening during configuration, but it kind of would contain only like this chaining of the configuration methods.
So you could need to call both, right? Depending on your use case, you might end up calling like use sockets HTTP handler twice, each overload.
So speaking of calling the thing twice, so the idea is if the primary handler is already a socket HTTP handler, either by previously calling use socket HTTP handler or by setting it as primary handler by existing method configure primary HTTP message handler, the next call would kind of update the existing handler without overwriting it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we could have some naming to make it clear, like what the difference is, because you know they're not exactly the same, right? It's like kind of different parts of the life cycle or the building stages.
Oh, I see. You are talking about use socket HTTP handler that has the action over like configuring the handler itself, and the one that's about the builder. Oh, I see. I understand your concern. It can if you look at the examples, it just would. This builder follows the same idea. If it was, for example, options and not a builder, you would have the method still called use socket HTTP handler, and then you would set the options, and this one would be still executed at configuration time, but the options would be applied on creation time. So I feel like they should be named the same.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I was wondering is like basically for the thing that happens later, right? For basically the configure handler callback, could we configure that via the iSocket HTTP handler builder, which happens earlier? So, you know, if I want to do any kind of like last minute modification of the sockets HTTP handler as it's being created, that's something I would do inside my configure builder callback. And so therefore, all of my configuration is in a single call to like use sockets HTTP handler, and I don't have to call it twice. And then like you could have, you know, some extension method on the handler builder, which is like configure handler or something, configure handler creation. I don't know. They just feel very different, right? Those two methods, even though they're overloads.
Yeah, I mean, the one that has the action, it is kind of convenience method because internally it just forwards to create a new builder and then passing this action to configure method on the builder. It just feels better to have, if you just have an action that you don't have to dance around the builder and you just give the section directly to use socket HTTP handler. But if you do want to have the configuration, iConfiguration as well, then you can use the builder.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also considering a world where you're setting like all these other options that were kind of like the extended proposal. So, you know, if I'm like, you know, set use cookies or whatever, and then I also want to do handler, it just, it seems very weird to call use sockets HTTP handler twice and have it do like.
Wait. Why would you call it twice? I don't understand why we call it twice.
Because they do different things, right? Like you said, like one is if you want to do like pre-service pre-building the service collection where you set like the default options and so forth via iConfiguration, or potentially via these new like set use cookies extension methods. And I want to like wrap the sockets HTTP handler, or not wrap it, because this API wouldn't allow it, but like do something to the sockets HTTP handler as it's created. Like those all feel like
that's what happens inside the builder. Like if you look at the example, like the third call that says use socket HTTP handler, and then on builder it says configure from the section, and then configure from the action, and you can write whatever, and that would happen on the handler creation, exactly what you want to do. You don't have to call use socket HTTP handlers the second time. You just change the configure method.
I mean, yes, but you don't think it's weird that you'd call .use sockets HTTP handler one method and then .use sockets HTTP handler another method? It's like configuring different things about the sockets HTTP handler.
I just don't fully understand why they're configuring different things. For me, it's like they're configuring the same thing, no?
Well, if they were, you'd have like a single context object or whatever, right? But these callbacks are running at different times. So having them be like overloads is very weird. Like if I see an overload to take two different callbacks, like without reading how it's implemented, I assume like the callbacks are going to be called like about the same time.
But the callbacks that do something about socket HTTP handler are executed at the same time. The callback that is doing something with builder, it's doing it like once to set the configuration inside the HTTP client factory options.
Yeah, I don't follow what you mean by different times. I mean, presumably the configure calls are executed immediately, right?
Configure calls are executed, yes, configure calls are executed on the builder immediately. It will save the action to configure socket HTTP handler to a collection, and this collection of actions would be executed when socket HTTP handler would be created.
Can you scroll up to the HTTP client builder extensions? Like the overloads to use sockets HTTP handler on the client builder extensions, right? Those are just very different methods. Like, and the callbacks run at very different times.
So are you talking about these guys or these guys?
Yes, the ones you had highlighted first.
These guys here?
Yeah, those overloads are not like similar at all. And like you could have the configure handler thing, like you could set that up via the iSockets HTTP handler builder, like, and it would be all contained in like a single use sockets HTTP handler callback. Like having those as overloads to each other just like doesn't make any conceptual sense to me. Like you could need one, you could need the other, you could need both. They do very different things.
Stefan, would you be happy if the first one would be use socket HTTP handler and the second one would be use socket HTTP handler builder? Would that make you happy?
No, not in my case.
No, I think I prefer, like, if we're gonna add this builder concept, like making it useful. and the like, okay, this is like where you configure like the socket handler stuff, and that's like the early thing. That's the stuff that runs the earliest, so that allows you to modify the service collection. And then if you want to also modify, just add a callback that runs at runtime, like you often do that on service collection based builders, right? Like you can configure it there.
I I'm still at a loss, honestly, how the second one is being used, because I don't think I've seen it in sample code. Like, where is this overload being called here in the sample code?
The third example.
This guy here?
Yeah. There's the builder and 2 configure calls on the builder.
So the interface is only used to expose these extension methods, basically?
Yes, and also to give possibility to add additional extension methods to fluently configure socket HTTP handler.
Right. And then like the next thing to do is like often extensions with these builders, like early on we used a lot of callbacks, but recently, with the things like, the authentication builder and so forth, we like reducing the nesting by like returning the iSockets like HTTP handler builder. So
returning this was the thing I considered, but it I didn't see what you've done with authentication builder. What was strange to me is that if you return the socket HTTP handler builder, then how do you return back to configure an HTTP client? Is there like some build method, or do you just extend HTTP client builder by this new interface, but then it feels weird how to name the methods, because you call use socket HTTP handler and then you call configure socket HTTP handler, and but if you just say configure, then it would look weird to call HTTP client builder methods. They just kind of don't align. I actually discussed this API with Steven, so like I kind of have a trump card. Steven approved this API, like Steven Taub. And I shown him the option with returning the builder, and he didn't like it.
That one I'm like less strong about, partly because we're less consistent with it. And like, yeah, you'd probably want a different name than use it sockets HTTP handler, but we do it, right? Like add authentication, like an example, right? Normally iService collection methods return an iService collection, so you can just like chain them, right? But not always. Yep. If you call like add authentication, it returns an authentication builder instead, and at that point you can call like add, jot token or like add cookies or whatever, and there's like a ton of extension methods. So especially, if we expect it to be common, it is nice to like reduce nesting. If you want to call trump cards, I bet you David Fowler would agree with me. But no, we can have them duke it out. Have the partners go at it. No, but like that, I don't feel as strongly about. I do not like that those methods are overloads, though. Like that, I feel more concerned with.
So how would you call them?
I would keep the first one, or the builder one, sorry, which is the second one. And then like I would do something like add a configure sockets HTTP handler or something on the iSockets HTTP handler builder as like an extension method.
We already have that one. We do have that one. Like we can't throw away this first method. It will just force anyone who wants to set one property in socket HTTP handler to use the builder method, and they wouldn't be able to use small one. Like
I mean, yes, it would force you to use the builder, but is that a problem?
Well, if you just want to set one line of code, then
this is basically what you can do currently, right? Because of the first overload.
This is the first overload, yeah.
And so instead of doing this, they would have to move this stuff into here, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, to here.
Yeah.
Well, now
do we have sense
into
what's
the
the typical
configure callback into the it would be upper levels still, right? It would be builder dot like configure handler or something, right?
Well, it would
And
still be
if we want to
nested
reduce the
lambda,
nesting
right?
even further, it would be nested unless, of course, we'd return the builder. And then that actually makes it the same amount of nesting. Just one more method call.
I'm still at a loss of
You
like,
know-
what do you mean by returning the builder? Like, I mean, presumably you have to return the IHTTP client builder because that's the thing you want to chain on the root call. So who would return the nested builder?
I mean, you definitely don't have to return the IHTTP client builder. Like the add authentication is like an example of a thing that like, right, it extends iService collection, returns like an authentication builder. We do the same thing for like add SignalR, add MVC on service collection, add logging, etc.
That would mean that you always do it in the end. Like you cannot do anything else after you set your socket handler. It would be like the last call. So you would never return to IHTTP client builder.
Or you store it in a variable if it matters, which I mean happens sometimes when you use these like sub builder patterns, but like variables exist.
Do we know how common it would be to set one property? All to me, it seems like advanced use case. So I don't know if he care about the simplicity, but
yeah, I mean, maybe the middle ground is to call it something else, right? Like if you really don't want to force people to call a thing to get a builder to do the sockets HTTP handler action, then just call those methods something else. Like they're not overloads of each other. They're doing very different things.
Well, they are doing basically like in terms of making your code have socket HTTP handler as a primary handler. They are doing the same thing, and then they configuring it differently. But the kind of the name of the method saying use socket HTTP handler, and like you will be using socket HTTP handler in both cases.
Okay, I mean that's a fair point. Then I mean I think we should just use the builder.
You mean name the second one use socket HTTP handler builder?
No, just
Or
like
what?
make the builder like the true way to configure the use sockets HTTP handler. Like having this whole like parallel configuration thing is like kind of weird because like it's weird that you might have to call both, like depending on your use case. Like usually when there are overloads of something, depending on your use case, you pick an overload. You know what I mean? This one has this situation where depending on your requirements, you might have to call both.
I don't understand why would you
odd.
need to call both, like really?
Like
in what case would you need to call both?
So I want to bind options for my configuration, and then like I want to like define a lambda or something, right? That I can't do from configuration. Are you saying that there's nothing that like I can do directly on the handler that I can't do
There
with
is a second configure method on the builder that has a lambda over.
Oh, I see. That already exists. Oh yeah, okay, I missed that. Well, then we can just delete the other one. That's even better. You already created it. It's great. So there is a need. Okay, so that does make it better that you don't have to do both. Actually, that does make it better. I'm sorry that I missed that call to configure.
That's why I wasn't able to understand why we're saying that you need to call both of them. You don't.
Yeah, you're right. I completely missed the action of sockets HTTP handler in the builder extensions. Yeah, no, that does make my concern less. And okay, at least we have that configure method. Yeah, all right. But yeah, if everyone else is fine with like the slight duplication, then, which I didn't realize that's all it was, is that it's kind of a fast path to just configuring the other thing, then I'm okay with that. Sorry for the huge digression.
No, makes sense. So then, so basically, we are saying then this one is a shortcut for this guy here, right? If I remember correctly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's how I understood it. Okay.
Or the first one, the first configure, but yeah,
Yeah.
the one that takes an action.
Sorry. Yeah.
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 I like the framing of it as a shortcut, to be honest, because it kind of speaks to the scenario that you're trying to simplify something that would otherwise require several more layers of indirection.
Yeah.
Which means
now
that you
I see
expect it to
as
be
a
the common
shortcut.
use case.
Yeah, I'm cool with it. I just missed that part of the proposal, skimmed past it. And then the reload on handler creation, I assume that means that you're not going to be trying to hook like the iConfiguration reload token, and you're just going to like reread it.
We removed that one. We removed the reload thingy.
Oh.
Because we discussed that first of all, it's kind of you can add it later if someone really would want it. By default, we still would want it false because of any additional additional reading of configuration. It might be performance concern. So like by default, we would want it off. And also like folks who asked for this said that they're going for immutable deployments, so they actually don't want it. And there was a third thing that it was super confusing between reread the configuration when the handler is created versus recreate the handler when configuration is changed. So it's kind of, we decided to drop it for now.
Yeah, I think it's fine. Like you said, you could add it later.
Yeah, so I was looking through the other APIs on the extensions and builders classes for things that kind of followed the same pattern, but I didn't see anything that exactly matched this. Is this introducing a new pattern, or is it like?
Sorry, just.
Yeah. Maybe Stefan, you could answer then, since she stepped out for a sec.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, we're good. So the question was, so I was looking at other APIs on the extensions class and on the builder class, and I didn't see anything that exactly matched the pattern that you're using here. Is this kind of in the same spirit as the other APIs in there? Like the way that you would configure a handler or a builder?
So the shortcut one is in the same spirit. The builder one is kind of working on top of what we had like with ISP client builder and allowing people to extend it by adding their own extension methods. But here I wanted this builder to be specifically for socket HTTP handler. So anyone extending that would know that if they are doing something on socket HTTP handler builder, then primary handler is socket HTTP handler.
Okay.
So yeah, that's kind of, the nesting is not super nice, I agree, but I tried to make returning the builder work, but it still looked better when it was inside, like in the nested way.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. I'm just trying to make sure that it kind of like looks similar to the state.
Yeah, like all the actions and builders are like very in spirit of HTTP client factory.
Okay. Oh, cool. Thank you for confirming that. That's good.
So we're cool with the API ship as proposed then? As far as I can tell, the only change we made was changing our configuration section to iConfiguration.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything else?
No, that was a good catch, Stefan.
Yeah, I think that's it. On my side. And yeah, like add logging actually is one of the ones that does the builder and the callback. It's inconsistent. Like other things like add MVC and add signal are return builders. So like we have done both.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Then the other ones. Let's do this one.
So this one, it's easy, and are actually both issues are somewhat related, not quite the same. So this comes from a problem that the current send to and receive from methods use endpoint, and the endpoint allocates IP address. The IP address might allocate an array, and when we try to use them, we would serialize them to some socket address or socket address internal, depending how it goes. And in cases of send to and receive from, we do it for every single packet. And when we receive it, again, we might take whatever we receive it from, and we might create an endpoint. Again, the same situation. We would allocate endpoint that allocates IP address, that might allocate socket buffer, or that might allocate internal buffer. And in worst cases, we also call map to IPv4, which basically doubles the stuff. So we have up to, I think, 8 or 12 allocations for every single packet you receive through UDP, and that kills the performance horribly. So people who try to use those methods for something like Unity mirroring and gaming and stuff, they suffer miserably, and basically the existing APIs are unusable for anything hyperv. So we've been talking about it, and the proposal Corey came up with a long time ago was basically use the socket address directly. That basically you pass in socket address to be filled with whatever that stuff is, or is received or sent to. The functions are symmetric. So for example, in the example, like the DNS server, you receive it from somewhere, you do your DNS processing, you send it back, you don't even need to know what it is. And so we would basically add 4 overloads, 1 sync, 1 async for each send and receive, and that's essentially it. And basically, the socket address would be updated in place. So rather than allocating new objects and sending back, and creating new instances or anything, that basically there'll be the only one caveat where somebody needs to be careful about not using it in multiple cases, right? So it's not thread safe. You cannot take the same address and pass it to multiple receive calls, for example.
So Jeremy, do these signatures make sense for general patterns? You're muted.
I'm more looking at them as just because they're just overloads on existing methods.
Correct. Yeah, so we basically have a same one or very similar one with remote endpoint, and the caveat is for the receive async, rather than returning the int or value task of int, we have struct which is receive from result, which basically has the endpoint and the receive length.
Gotcha.
Because we trying to return 2 things, so we created a struct wrapper, whereas this one, it's much simpler. It basically returns the bytes read, and because we update the passed in object, we don't need to return it back as a separate sort of instance. So the API is very similar, but much simpler in a sense.
So the change is not relating to span. It's more like that you pass in the other things as individual parameters then?
Correct. So rather than using endpoint, which then has this whole thing, and creating new instance of endpoint on receiving,
Right.
we basically passing in socket address, and we update the socket address in place.
Gotcha. Then that makes sense to me.
Is updating socket address in place obvious? Expected?
Well, we need to document it properly. So that's basically a way how to avoid the allocations and creating new objects on every packet. So I hope the answer is yes. And this is really specific to UDP and people who try to do high-perf UDP. So I think the subset of users will be probably pretty small.
Right, but like, what are you supposed to pass in? Because you can't pass in null.
So you pass in this.
Can you scroll up?
Same thing.
So you just make a non-addressed. So you make a family only address, and then call
Correct.
receive from, and now it has what the so is the family that's there actually relevant? Will that not receive from an IPv4?
It is relevant in a sense that it needs to be big enough. So this will allocate a buffer inside, which is essentially needed, or whatever is needed for that address family type. So it would be, I think, 16 bytes for IPv6, and it would be, I think, 8 for IPv4, and for Unix domain sockets, it would be 128 or something. And basically, the constructor for the socket address already exists with the address family, and it gets you out of the business of knowing for each platform how big that needs to be. So basically, the constructor says, and
right. So but if you said new socket address of internetwork v4, and what you really got, and so is that going to block receiving from a v6 because it couldn't fit the address, or is it going to try and just replace it anyway?
I think it will throw because it would not fit into the allocated space. So the receive from would throw with I don't know exactly what it would be. I think be
but if you pass the whatever the big one you said was, the like Unix domain socket or whatever.
Yeah.
It'll be like, oh, but I can totally fit an IPv4 in this, and then it'll write the value and change the family.
Yes.
That seems really bizarre.
And we could prevent it if we choose to.
Well, like, it's weird that if you just pick, if not knowing how things work, you pick an address family that just doesn't have as big of an addressing scheme, that now you're gonna throw depending on how the socket was actually opened. But if you pick the biggest answer, when there's not a be as big as you can socket address option, that it'll just reflect whatever network type it saw. Like, this seems really bad from a usability perspective. And I'm aware that only like 20 people want to use it, but I think all 20 are going to get it wrong.
So one thing you could do is you can say socket address family unspecified. It would allocate whatever the maximum socket size address can ever exist on a given platform that gives you big enough buffer. And basically, when you receive it, you would know exactly what address you receive it from, right? Both the family and the address itself.
Okay, and then if you say unspecified and you call receive from and it sets it to IPv4, it's going to use the same big buffer but only use a slice of it. And then if you call receive from you pass it to another receive from, and then that's IPv6, it'll still work because the buffer's still big enough to hold it, and it'll just flip it to IPv6 now?
Yes, essentially.
Okay. So really the reference example should not say IPv6, it should say unspecified, and then everything just works. You can pick a smaller thing if you're smarter, but
Yeah.
the reference example should say, when calling this, your original socket address should say unspecified so that any address fits.
So the reason why I choose this one is that IP, it's common, and you can have dual mode socket which can receive both IPv4 and IPv6. So you would create a socket address which fits at least IPv6, and then you can retrieve either of those. But as you said, I can update the example, or for the documentation, you can do example of the unspecified, or basically clarify this piece. And we might talk about it more on the other proposal as well. So.
And then on socket address, is the size property how big the buffer is, or is that how big the current addressing family scheme is?
It's how the current address is, how big is the current address is.
Okay.
So I'm looking at the socket address source code right now. Is the size of the buffer actually dependent on the address family you pass to the constructor? It looks like it always just uses the same max size.
That's some of the code is wrong. It's come from ages, and for example, would not work for Unix domain sockets, which is something I'm trying to fix in 8 as well. I just didn't want to lump it to this discussion about the socket receive and send to.
Okay, I mean, yeah, it still feels weird that this is give me a mutable object that I can obliterate, because I don't know that we have a lot of precedent for that, but
that could be incorrectly sized. Like, that's also kind of like, I get that with throw, but
So I have a weird question. Is the idea that, so what the problem with the original API, is it that it's returning the same it's returning different endpoint instances over and over again that encompass the same value, or it actually has to return different contents every time?
Well, it depends what you receive it from, right? So if you, and there's some code to cache bits and pieces. So if you would receive from always from the same endpoint, it could return, and it would check actually if the endpoint is equal, and if it is, then you would not allocate new endpoint. But the pattern for like the gaming is you have 3-4 peers that keep getting updates for your game state from different addresses. So in practice, you need to allocate new instance every single time because the value is different.
That sounds like you don't need to allocate a new instance every time. You just keep 3 or 4 cached, and then you return one of the 3 or 4.
Well, the problem is that the objects are mutable. So once someone has reference to them, they can do all kinds of nasty stuff in them. And there was a path we discussed with Anton and Steve Taub that even the IP address is mutable. And so that's the caching becomes problematic. If we have immutable endpoint, then yes, we could do that. But we come to point or conclusion that's basically not safe.
I mean, could you set like some sort of private bit on IP address and socket address, which is like, can't mutate me?
And we already have subclass of that. But again, there'll be a breaking chain. So yes, we already have code which does it for IP address any, for example. So it's a subclass of IP address, and it's immutable. So you cannot change IP address any.
Right. And the current receive from that takes endpoint address or whatever it is, it takes it ref, and so presumably it's doing the, if it's the same, don't update it. If it's different, then it gives you a new one.
Yep. Yeah, but in the practice, it does almost every single time in many of the use cases. So
yeah, it's really weird because socket address feels like an input parameter on receive, but really it's really an output parameter.
Yeah, having not done UDP, I'm like, oh, it lets you specify what the remote address has to be. Like, I thought it was like some sort of discriminator, and then I looked at it, but
yeah, like I don't know how to name it, of like socket address object that totally gets updated to be whatever the value is that was read off the top of the network buffer, and
we can call it received socket address or something, or I don't know.
As to the Frederick's point in chat, like the ref would just be an empty signaler because it would never be writing back to it. It's going to just use the fact that it's a mutable object. It would never replace it. And so the ref would be misleading.
Well, you could, I think the idea from chat was that the very first, you would have a field whose initial value is null, and then receive from would populate it to whatever is big enough to hold anything on the very first call. And then you would keep reusing that reference over and over again.
Oh, that's interesting.
Fair enough. I mean, I guess that would also solve the what to do if you give a thing that didn't have a big enough buffer. Is like, fine, now I'll write back through your ref. I gave you a bigger buffer.
That also seems nicer, like, than just throwing.
And does give the hint of, I guess, because ref is good for the signaling of like, this might change. You should pay attention to it after you're done. And especially if we would add the scenario that like you can be ref to null in the first case and ref to too small later, and like, sure, we'll fix it now.
The refs are unpleasant for the async, so that's the caveat.
Right.
That's true.
So this is basically the simplest solution we come up with, and yes, it might be obvious, but again, the idea is we would try to recommend it as best as we can.
Fair enough. I wish somebody, including me, but I can't, could come up with a good, like the received socket address might be the name to put on there to just indicate like, I'm using a mutable object as an out value without using the out keyword.
We can do that. It'll be certainly easy to do, or maybe good thing to do anyway. So regardless of.
Yeah. So we're gonna make any changes to the API then, or is it that's the way we do it?
I think we're discussing renaming the parameter on receive from to received socket address or received address.
Received address seems best. Yeah.
And then just the documentation will say,
and say when
we write the answer into the subject.
We do this for both receive from and receive from async, right?
Yeah.
This is
like insent to isn't mutating anything, right? Like that is
correct.
Just the address.
Yeah.
The weird thing is, like, I can very easily see somebody saying, oh, I want to receive from a specific address. So they call receive from, pass in an address. And now, like, how on earth would they ever know that the API doesn't do what the name says it does?
Yeah, and if they'd save that address into a field of who is it that they're trying to talk to, and now it's like, well, here's who you last heard from.
Right.
Like, well,
it's a footgun, and in testing you might not catch it.
Yeah. That's the thing. Like
yourself.
you're not going to catch it until you start scaling up, which means it's going to fall over in production, not in testing. And like read the docs can't be our answer to everything. I mean, I guess
we could
be, but
we could make a mutable socket address holder type, which is basically just letting it pass as ref.
Anton mentioned that in the chat.
Yeah,
basically.
I'm saying this is good enough. For the 6 people in the world that want to call the API.
The problem is, like, there might be 6 people in the world who want to call this API, but the API is on a type and has a method name that will be seen by more than 6 people.
Right,
Well,
there might be 6 people who
like,
actually want to use it, but there will be more people who try to call it.
Dangerous receive from.
no.
What's dangerous about it? You don't know how to call it. Read the docs. Now read them again. Read them one more time, and now you might
That's our
understand
new convention. Receive from, please read the docs, async.
There we go. Receive from RTFM.
Okay, very, very silly question. What if we introduced a new nested subclass, a new nested class off a socket address that you would access through? I have some socket address and I call my socket address.getReceiver, and it returns what is basically a value wrapper around socket address. And that's the thing that you pass into the receive from method. It literally just, it introduces one layer of indirection just through a nested type.
You can't make a value type wrapping the reference and pass that in, because then the reference wouldn't get updated correctly.
It doesn't need to contain the reference. Well, it would have a regular managed object reference. It wouldn't have like a
Right.
ref_t
Yeah,
reference,
but
which means it would work in async.
But I mean, like, you could pass address.get reference receiver, but like, is that really telling you that the object itself is going to be changing?
It forces you to actually write the words at the call site. I acknowledge this is going to be mutated. Which means people won't run into this, just trying to do their normal course of operations.
Could we just hide the new overloads in, let's say, VS, so people are less likely to screw up?
Well, you can do this.
I know, again, it's not.
But then the 6 people that want to call the API, for them it really sucks.
All right. So just think. I think I hear what you said, Levi. So basically, we make an internal type or nested type on socket address called buffer.
Yes.
Then this takes socket address dot buffer, and then socket address gains a get buffer that just returns value type wrapping this.
Basically, yeah.
And then
like
the
it wouldn't be called
says,
buffer, but it's
Sure. And but then you would have like pass me a socket address dot buffer, and it would be like, oh, I'll receive a socket address buffer.
Yes. And this is the thing I'm going to write into.
And then because you had to go out of your way to say socket address dot buffer, that you now have the idea of, oh, it's writing back into this address.
Basically, yes.
So we're proposing to actually add a buffer on the other proposal, or actually a memory to expose the stuff directly for other reasons.
But it would be memory of byte, right?
Correct. It's a memory of byte.
So it wouldn't be as like strongly typed as a socket address dot buffer if that was. I know that's not the name.
The problem is that the sizes vary radically, right? So you don't necessarily want to have a value type which is 120 bytes for IPv4, because then basically if you do mostly IPv4 traffic, which most people would, you pay penalty for a large object even if you will never ever use it.
It doesn't have to be a value type though, right? It's just more to make the API more obvious that it's mutating something. Like it'd still be a class.
Well, a value type has the nice benefit that like you don't have multiple threads trying to access it, all that stuff, unless you pass it by ref.
I mean, and
so
basically all it would be doing is just it's a signal wrapping the mutable type that just says like, be aware, I'm going to change.
So we talk about passing memory of bytes directly to this in-service socket address. That'd be another option. Is like, if you care what the address is, give us big enough buffer. But at the end, the socket address. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And then you would use that on both send to and receive from. So you just basically lose all the strong typing. Yeah.
Right. Because that's what essentially it is. You know, when you do the actual OS calls, you give it a buffer, and the OS writes to that buffer. And so basically, in the practice, we take the buffer from the socket address and we write to it, and that's basically used for the socket calls.
Do most people actually? Do people want the address from receive from? Or is
send back in the example? Like, if you're like responding.
Some do, some don't. So it's a mix and match. And that's the other proposal to make the socket address more useful. So should you care, you do have access to it, but you cannot at the moment.
So give me 7 minutes over. Like, we need to make a decision. Like, go back to the drawing board and come back with a better design, or do we approve it as is? But I don't think we're gonna come up with a design here. More in the remaining time.
I think Send2 is fine.
Yeah, Send2 is fine.
All right.
So. Yeah, we can approve Send2.
I was about to say, why don't we come back to it Tuesday then, and we look at the other proposal, which talks about the socket address improvements. And maybe it would make sense altogether.
Okay, so you just want to hold the whole thing until talking about some socket address changes?
Well, in a practice, we could live with just this API, but to make it somewhat useful, it would depend on the other one as well. And that one makes the size on socket address mutable, which currently isn't, and it would add a memory of byte access. So the socket address is mutable through indexer, which is really unpleasant to use. So basically, the proposal is to add explicit option to get the buffer from the socket address, which you cannot do right now. And I would possibly make it open avenue for passing the buffer straight to those calls, should we choose to. And I guess it would make it easier for you guys to kind of think about it more until Tuesday.
Fair enough.
Sounds good.
And we'll, miss the platform complete, but I hope I can get sort of exception because nobody really depends on it other than sort of some couple application writers. But this is the highest upvoted issue in networking, so we talk about it with Steven, and we would really, really, really like to squeeze it into 8. And I have basically a working prototype, so as long as we agree on a shape, I'm hopeful we still can.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's just about the ergonomics of how you receive the socket address back.
And that's always been the problematic part. And as I said, this is the best thing we come up with after many, many rounds of discussion. So, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think Levi's idea was interesting. You might want to prototype that even as much as Emo was shaking his head on it. I think it won't look as bad as Emo's head shake suggested.
I kind of agree.
It's just one avenue of exploration, right?
Yeah, I'm just like, sure. It is a thought. I'm not saying it's the right answer, but it's a thought.
It's a thought. I can get behind that statement.
It is a thought. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thought.
All right, then I see all of you on Tuesday. Have a great weekend, my friends.
That sounds good.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.